Hi Professor, my name is Jacob. Before I start this video, I first want to thank you for two things. I want to thank you for taking my criticisms in consideration. You know what I'm talking about. I really felt appreciated. I also want to thank you for making really good videos, because I learn a lot from watching your videos. When it comes to the subject of say, culture, communication, the way we express ourselves, whatever, I think they're brilliant. That being said, I want to point out that whenever you talk about so-called religious dogma, as you like to put it, you're talking about a way that really puts me off, that really turns me off. I remember, like, in your video to Aaron Raw, I remember commenting, and I quote, and you said, and I quote, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but for many people, Christianity is a cult of death denial." I was really offended by that, not because of the content, but by the arrogance and the tone of it. This was to me the equivalent of someone being full of academic snobbery about the whole, like, a whole idea of any sort of, like, religious idea. If you disagree with a religious idea and you find it silly, you just brush it off as some sort of like cultists or some sort of like death denial or something, which I find just totally absurd. Maybe I misunderstood you. I could be wrong. So if I misunderstood you, you can clarify for me. The point is this. I find the whole idea that we have to have this discussion about, well, like, is there an afterlife? Is there an afterlife? What happens to us when we die? I think it's a legitimate question, to be honest. And for you to brush it under the rug and act like act like the whole idea of it is just wishful thinking or whatever you want to put it. It's just, to me, it's just to me a sign of academic snobbery. It just frustrates me to no end, because to me the question as to what happens to us when we die is a legitimate question. I mean, when we die, do we cease to exist? Does our consciousness, like, survive death? I think it's a legitimate question. You then go on to state that you didn't talk about, like, I think it was, I can't remember if it was in the comments section or in one of your videos. I don't remember exactly where it was. You talked about how, like, in order for religion to be more legitimate, you said it has to reconcile theology with science. And in a way, I do agree. I don't think science whatsoever tells us if there's an afterlife. You mentioned something about neuroscience. I think that was. I don't remember exactly. But the problem is, I don't believe neuroscience has any say whatsoever on whether there's an afterlife. I found this interesting article related to the idea of religious people, like, and then being afraid of neuroscience. I'll post a link to that article in the description box. I now want to move on to talk about your idea about death denial. And this is what frustrates me the most about your videos. You basically talk about how belief in an afterlife is the equivalent to saying you deny death, that you are afraid to die, that you are afraid of that you're afraid to face death. So you make up this whole fantasy idea that if you die, you go into some sort of happy place. You know, and when you talk about it like that, it really frustrates me to no end, because it just reeks of arrogance. And just it end up generalizing almost every person who believes in an afterlife as saying that they're afraid to die. It's just so frustrating when you do that. And another thing is, when you talk about death denial when it comes to belief in an afterlife, you don't even clarify what you mean by this. Do you mean denial of physical death, spiritual death, the idea that we die, our consciousness ceases to exist? What do you even mean by that? Now, let me ask you this. let me ask you like two questions. What is death? Is death the end of the physical body, or is it both the end of the physical body and the consciousness? Is death a part of life or the end of life? Plain and simple. Because the problem is, in order to have any sort of meaningful discussion about afterlife, you need to answer those questions first before we can move on to discussion. Does that make sense? Now, I remember specifically you talking about the idea that religious people who believe in afterlife are driven by that belief. You also cite like examples of like the 9/11 terrorist attacks. You talk about like bombings in Iraq and I don't know exactly how you put it, but you put it somewhere down that line that people that religious people are driven by a belief in an afterlife. And so by that reasoning, you would have to conclude that I am driven by a belief in an afterlife too. Problem is, Professor, my life is not driven by a belief in an afterlife. It's based on having a relationship with the Creator, with the divine, as you would call it. In fact, almost any sane religious person would tell you the same thing. Doesn't matter which religion. It's not driven by a belief in the afterlife, because if we're talking monotheistic religions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever, belief in God and belief in afterlife are intertwined with one another. Because let's face it, according to those religions, the afterlife is the dwelling place for God. And those religions are all about having a relationship with the Creator. And when we die, we get to spend eternity with the Creator. The problem is that it's not based on some sort of like trial and error. It's based on having a relationship with the Creator. This is where your whole like idea that like like um like wars or like religious oppression is not based on belief in God but based on belief in afterlife is flawed. Because if you think about it, why would someone, sane religious person, be driven by a belief in an afterlife if they're not driven by a belief in the Creator? If we're talking monotheistic religions. Now, I do not deny whatsoever that there are many people who are driven who believe in an afterlife based solely because they're afraid to die, or they are in death denial, as you call it. But I don't. I think. But when the problem is, that when you try to like lump so many people who believe in afterlife into one category, and calling that category saying that, well, you believe in an afterlife because you're afraid to face death. Here's the problem with that argument. If let's say you make that argument to someone who believes in the afterlife, and you say, well, you believe in the afterlife because you're afraid to face death. I could be that person. I could try to take that argument and switch it around on them and say, well, you don't believe in an afterlife because you're afraid to face judgment. Or you want to deny that you face judgment. The thing I've come to learn is that whenever you can take an argument like that and switch it on the other person, it makes me question the validity of that argument. You know what I'm saying? Now, before I end this video, I just want to say one last thing. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, that you're right. That when I die, that's it. No soul, no life after death. When I die, that's it. There's nothing beyond my grave. And that's it. If that's the case, then I led a happy life. The idea of there no being life after death doesn't bother me one bit. I would have gone to my grave with I would have lived my life with a false belief. Plain and simple. That's it. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid to face whatever happens after death. Doesn't bother me one bit. Thank you for watching.